All right. Well, welcome everybody. We have got a special guest with us here today, but in the meantime, I'm just going to share out my screen, Michelle, because we have a few things that we need to cover before we get started. So I'll share this out and let's see. Well, Jim, anything from you, by the way?
Just really excited to have Ryan on the call this week, our special guest. So it's too bad that it's a light week in terms of participants. Ryan, we're usually right around 50 or so. So but I'm sure word is going to get out that you were on, and maybe we can get you back again, and then the next one will balloon. But really excited to have you and appreciate your time today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, I echo that, Jim. All right, Michelle, I'm going to jump to here because I have you up first. I have the URL. I can put it in chat, but talk to us about stuff with Bo, because I know some folks wanted to share. Yeah, I would recommend sharing this to everybody. This is going to be a great event. So go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I think Andy wanted this, and I don't even see him on here, but that's okay. We're going to be talking to him in a little while. So I created a page that you guys can share. You can actually send to peer groups, and folks can add it to their calendars. So I think, Andrew, you're going to share that, right? You got it.
I think it's in chat. I hope
it's in chat now. So that will be July 13th, 20th, and 27th with Bo, and he's going to be going through that new expansion pack of backdoors and breaches, which should be a lot of fun. I think I like gamifying things.
Absolutely. Ryan, I don't know if you heard, but they came out with the cloud edition of backdoors and breaches.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. So Bo's going to be taking some simulations and, really focusing on a lot of things that SaaS alerts and this community sees around credential compromise and things of that nature. So that'll be awesome. Yeah, please share it if you can. We'd really like to get a good group together. This is the one time, as Jim said last week, that we're not looking to make this the exclusive club. We want to really help as many people as we can with these attacks. And as we bring Ryan in here in a little bit, we're going to be talking about how the landscape has changed, and SaaS attacks and credentials are where it's at. So with that, Leron, I'll jump back here, and I think you had something on respond rule default severity, if I recall correctly.
That is correct, Andrew. Thank you. So this will be.
You need to share, by the way. So
yes,
perfect.
This will be very quick. So we've made one small adjustment to our respond rules. So previously, when you created a respond rule, whether it was low, critical, or medium, when the initial rule fired, right? So your conditions, whatever you've defined here, was met, it would initially give you whatever you've defined here. But then the follow-up that told you whether your action was successful or not was always medium. And if you set a low rule, people came to us and basically said, why is my low rule creating PSI tickets? And so we thought, okay, that makes sense. So we changed it. So now all of the events associated with a respond rule are now going to follow the alert severity that you define here. So you create a rule and it's critical. Everything else that happens with this rule will be critical. And what I mean by that is, if you have a rule that is outside approved location and it helps automatically block accounts that are outside approved location, the initial firing of the rule will be critical. And then the actual action where we block it inside of Microsoft will always be critical as well. So it just provides a little bit more consistency.
Any comments, questions?
All right, that's it for me, Andrew.
All right. All right, let's move on with our special guest, and we'll get right on into this fireside chat. So one of my favorite people, Ryan Weeks, joining us. Ryan is also, I'll let him tell you. Actually, let me let him tell all about him. I don't want to steal his thunder, but Ryan knows, I put it together his, just a few things that Ryan knows about. I've had the good fortune of working with Ryan for the past, 4 years now. We go all the way back to PerchyCon, Ryan.
Yeah.
It's awesome to have you with us. And
Yeah. Thanks.
yeah, bring us up to speed a little.
Yeah. So many of you know I'm the former CISO of Datto. I've been taking some time off, primarily working with Andrew on Right of Boom. So for those of you that may not be aware, Andrew and I, kind of came up with this idea a few years ago to have the Right of Boom conference follow more of a structured journey. Like I have a lot of beefs. I've been to a lot of security conferences. There are a lot of things I didn't like. And so Andrew was like, hey, why don't you just direct the content for us? So been spending a lot of time there and doing some startup advisory work, just generally keeping myself sort of busy, but also giving myself the freedom to enjoy my family. So yeah, that's kind of what's going on for me right now. Yeah, I've done the security thing for a couple decades, so I have some experience. Kind of started off in the financial services fintech space around the time that financial banking malware and exploit kits were really becoming a major thing. And then kind of moved over to Datto around the same time that those threat actors were really starting to move into ransomware as a service and converting their exploit kits more towards that. So I've somehow managed to, move ahead of the threat actors. Yeah, I've kind of been fighting this fight for a while. So I've seen a lot and have some stories, and hopefully we'll have a fun time talking about them today.
So they're following you is what you're saying, Ryan.
I don't know. I feel like maybe they are, but I don't know. Maybe that's a little too egotistical for me. But
and Ryan, Andrew tells me that you guys have been working on some awesome content for Right of Boom. So if anyone needs an additional excuse to register for Right of Boom, you got another one, because from what I understand, the content this year is going to be even better than it has the last two, based on what Andrew and Ryan have been cooking up. So
yeah, I think this year we have, we have 2 prior year conferences under our belt. We've got some experience with what resonates, what doesn't resonate. And frankly, I just have more time to focus on the content this year. So it should really be a home run. Not that the past years haven't been, but I think this year, it's going to be the grand slam event. So yeah, it should be a great conference. Really exciting. It'll be the first one that I'll be able to be in person for since COVID. So I'm excited for any of you that are going to be there to shake your hand and share a coffee or a beverage, and we'll have a good time.
Nice. Great stuff.
Quick story, Jim, and then we'll get right on into this, I promise. We were, we switched, you can relate to this because you ran Kaseya's events for many years. So we were switching platforms. We're on Cvent, which is a yay if you're so it's gonna be a lot better for the vendors. Well, I think overall better for attendees too, their registration platform. But we were going through the e-commerce test and there's a lot of APIs and commerce integration with Stripe and all this kind of stuff, and they're like, your system is having issues, your account with Stripe is having issues, and Ryan's sitting there literally on screen debugging the APIs in code that Cvent's calling. He goes, actually no, it's your API.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised in the least bit.
It was pretty funny. All right, so Ryan, let's take a trip. Starting off today, we're going to talk about the Verizon data breach report, which we talked a little bit about last week. But in order to do that, let's take a trip down memory lane. Why do we want to kind of start here and look at the MSP compromises?
Yeah, I mean, the TLDR here is, as an industry, kind of thinking of the IT channel as an industry, this MSP, SMB ecosystem, we're largely still suffering the same types of breaches that we were when the industry really came under attack in 2018. The earliest MSP compromises were credential compromises and exploitation of vulnerabilities in web applications. And if you've read the Verizon data breach report, like every page, like you cannot flip through a page of that report without reading about credential compromises or exploitation of vulnerabilities or web apps. So yeah, I think, and there's been, I don't know, dozens of different iterations of this problem throughout the history of MSP compromises. But I think today we're going to focus in a little bit more specifically on credentials and what's new and what's not new in terms of the world of credentials. And yeah, so that's kind of your TLDR on the history of MSP compromises. It's like, it's the same stuff over and over and over again, and eventually we'll learn our lesson. But I think MSPs that are getting ahead of this stuff are uniquely situated to protect themselves and their customers outside of their supply chain risks, and we can talk about that too. So we'll get into it.
Very cool.
Great.
By the way, questions, Jim, that, let's encourage like this. I don't want this to be a monologue that,
Right.
so please, chime in. Like Ryan loves interacting with MSPs. So challenge, ask. If you don't understand something, please bring it up.
Yeah. And by the way, like Ryan, you and I have been at a number of panels and stuff in the past together. We really haven't talked a lot about SaaS alerts, since you left Datto. But one of the things that we talk about in terms of why we exist as SaaS alerts is because we fundamentally believe that there is a paradigm shift moving from a device-centric approach to security, which MSPs have focused on for many, many years for good reason, to now a user-based or centric approach, right? And that's what we focus on here at SaaS alerts is users can log in from countless different devices to their application. So fundamentally, it's become more important to follow the user than actually tracking down each and every device.
I 100% support that. I mean, I remember 3 or 4 years ago at a DattoCon, Robert Herjavec came up on stage and, we asked him, where do you think the security industry is going? And he said, everything's going to the device. Like security is on the device. You need to have EDR. You need to be, managing your devices really strongly. And that was true at the time, but at the same time, there was also this undercurrent of credential compromise, account takeover, identity management issues that in the past couple of years has just exploded. And again, if you read the data breach report, above and beyond any other year, credential compromise and identity management is becoming, I would argue, just as important as endpoint security, if not more important, because more and more of your customer services are moving towards SaaS apps and web apps. And so web app security, whether it's how those apps are getting identities asserted or doing authentication, or how they're doing secure coding, how the infrastructure that supports those web apps is getting patched. All of that stuff is becoming, frankly, just as important. It kind of continues that ecosystem of supply chain compromise that we continue to see. The latest iteration is the MOVEit vulnerability, but it feels like as an industry we live through one of these things at least every 3 months, and it's not going away. So yeah, again, it'll be exciting to get into some of the more detailed stuff. So just couldn't support that focus anymore than what you've laid out. It really is super important to be really, really focusing on identity management for you as an MSP, for you and your employees and your third parties, as well as your customers, and helping them with it. Because as the Verizon data breach report says, 49% of all of the breaches across all different breach types relate back to use of stolen credentials. That's half of the breaches. And when you look at vulnerability exploitation is actually a smaller percentage overall of all breaches. So, the Verizon data breach report would actually argue identity management is actually more important than basic IT hygiene. I don't know if I could go that far. I think they're both super important right now. But if you're not really paying attention to identity management, like you got to get your head in the game. Like you're gonna lose the battle if you don't have that stuff in order.
Right. Well, the good news is you're talking to the right folks on this call, right? Because they wouldn't be here if that wasn't a focus of theirs. And that's I applaud our early adopters as much as I possibly can, because they recognize exactly what you're saying, and we're here to help them win on that transition, essentially.
Yeah, for sure.
If I could just put an exclamation point on what you said, Ryan, I was with John Strand about a week and a half ago for a few days. And, he stood in front of the room. We were doing actually a 4 hours backdoors and breaches session. And he basically, I'll sum it up, like EDR is tough for us as an offensive group these days. If you got a good EDR, he goes, it's not like the old days for us. He goes, EDR we could bypass no problem. And a few years back, he goes, these days, he goes, that's not where we're going to look to do an offense. That's not our bread and butter anymore. He goes, if we want to get tripped, that's where we'll go.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you that have heard me on the cyber call, or that we're Datto customers and attended webinars with me, I have a mental model for this, and I'm a huge fan of mental models and frameworks. Attackers are like electrons. They're going to go to the path of least resistance. If we make it harder to evade EDRs and attack endpoints, they're going to pivot. They're going to go to another path, and that path is users. Users are ultimately the thing that get access to systems, networks, data, etc. And the only thing you need to become the user is their identity. And so that's one of the reasons that we're seeing a massive, massive uptick, and also a major change in the tactics used in social engineering, which again, we'll talk about when we finally get into this thing. But it all kind of relates, that you cannot ignore, if you ignored the signals a year or two ago, you cannot ignore the fact that this is a major problem, and solving it is going to, is on the cusp of becoming table stakes for any MSP that has a services offering that has security in the name. It's becoming fundamental to providing a security service to a customer.
Awesome.
So Andrew, I'll jump in and make just a quick comment. I know that Ryan knows this, but I want to share it for the MSPs. So we do a lot of sharing here to help provide talk track for our partners, our customers. And the other reason that the account itself becomes of so much more value than the device is because of how fungible it is. It's used everywhere. You steal a Microsoft 365 account, it's not just used for logging into Microsoft 365. There's so much ubiquity of using OAuth to log into other applications. You get to someone's password and they often use it, reuse it as their online banking password. I mean, that's why that's the extra sauce for the attacker.
Yeah, I mean, when people ask me what's the most important online service to have like super strong identity security around, my answer is always email. Because if you pop someone's email, every single password reset in the world sends you a password reset email to your email address. So if your email gets popped, I have access to every single account. I'll just reset them all. And I'll create mail rules to route those messages to different folders or automatically delete them once I reset them. But like, you're not going to know it's happening. That's the ecosystem that we're in now. So yeah, M365 protection, whatever your email platform is, hopefully it's not Exchange. If you are, we'd be having a totally different conversation. But
no one on this call is using Exchange.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Or at least no one will admit it, right?
Yeah.
So but yeah, like that's M365 protection is probably amongst, and again, we're going to get into this. It's more than just email too, which is going to be super exciting. We're going to talk about some threat actors and the entire M365 ecosystem, not just email. So let's do this. Let's get into
Let's do that.
some detail.
So Ryan, let's talk about the evolution. Like, what is an info stealer? Let's talk about the evolution of it and why should MSPs know about these guys?
Yeah, so your brief history of info stealers is basically they're one of the problems attackers have had, kind of especially in the kind of the extortion era of hacking, which is kind of the post financial banking malware era, is how do you source victims, or they would call them customers, right? How do you acquire customers? And there were some botnets initially that were like, well, hey, we already have access to this machine. We could just give you access to our botnet. You could deliver your ransomware through these botnets. And that still exists to some extent. I mean, we talked about this again somewhere at some point in time with Andrew, about TrickBot, which was used by the Ryuk ransomware guys who eventually got folded into Conti. They eventually brought Emotet back to life, which is a social engineering phishing bot that has high success in actually infecting machines. And Emotet over time has become really an exploit kit, which means it has a lot of different functionality. One of which is info stealing. And so the attackers have created malware specifically to help them acquire new customers. And that's created a rise of an ecosystem inside the hacking world of access as a service. So there are threat actors who specifically only focus on acquiring access to customers. Now, there are a variety of ways they do that. They may exploit vulnerabilities, a la Clop ransomware, focusing on MoveIt right now. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And there's also these info stealers, which are starting to really heavily focus on theft of identities. And we should probably pause here and define an identity because it's becoming more complex. And remember, I said attackers are like electrons. So as we're adopting MFA, the attackers are trying to figure out, well, how do I still get access to an account? Well, MFA is a pre-authentication protection. You are not logged in, so I will force you to provide me something you know, something you have, or something you are, in order to authenticate you in addition to your password, because we all know passwords alone are bad. So that pre-authentication has become more complicated for them. So what the info stealers, and I think this has really been driving the info stealer market, is they're focusing on both pre-authentication identity compromise and post-authentication identity compromise. And so what is post-authentication identity compromise? So let's say you log into M365. Once you log in with your MFA, you don't re-MFA every time you click a button or do something that would be incredibly unfriendly and not really usable. So what websites do is they issue you a session identifier, a session token. And so what these info stealers are doing is they're stealing passwords. They're stealing, they're stealing databases of passwords. They're stealing notes files containing passwords. They're stealing Excel files containing passwords. But they're also looking in browsers and they're stealing credentials out of browsers. They're stealing credit cards that you may have stored in your browser. And then what they're starting to do is also stealing the sessions of the services that you're already authenticated to. And then what they're doing with that it's kind of ingenious is they're packaging that all up. And there's so Genesis Market, which recently just got taken offline, was something that we were actually battling against and monitoring quite closely for MSP compromise in my time at Datto. What would happen is if they got, let's say, one of your techs got an email and got an info stealing malware installed on it. Let's take Redline. Redline's my favorite info stealer. For those of you that were at the first Right of Boom, I actually did an entire threat model around the Redline info stealer. It continues to be one of the most successful info stealers around, and it's becoming a crowded market, but they're definitely still kind of top tier. So what they do is they gather all this data, and then in the Genesis Market, you could buy Brian Weeks's info stealing package. And what Genesis would do is they would load that up for you in a way that you would effectively just like get my Google Chrome instance with everything I was already logged into. Now, granted, some websites may have restrictions on like, oh, this session is being used from an IP address I've never seen before, re-MFA these. The problem is that type of control is very, very rare. And my argument to you would be any vendor that you are using that provides a critical service to you or a critical service to your customers, which you should be identifying when you do risk assessments and business impact assessments with your customers. Those are conversations you should be having with them around how do you protect post-authentication data and prevent it from being used from locations which were not the originator of those requests. The modern way of approaching that is when you detect that anomalous behavior, you do step-up authentication, which is, oh, you're coming from a new IP address, you should provide your MFA token again, or you should put your fingerprint down, or you should let Windows Hello capture your face again. So yeah, info stealers are evolving, and really what they're doing is they're solving this massive need for sourcing of victims for these for these ransomware operators and air quotes, more so extortion operators now, because we'll talk about this in a little bit, but with Clop and the Move It vulnerability, we're actually seeing them not ransom people. And you're like, wait, a ransomware operator that's not ransoming people? Well, yeah, because they realize they don't need to. They can just steal your data, threaten DDoS, and probably get you to pay anyway. And oh, by the way, these they probably have a backdoor to your ecosystem, so they don't need to actually pull the ransomware trigger right away. So info stealers are kind of the way it goes, and it's interesting because this is creating a very interesting ecosystem for M365 and social engineering, which I think we'll talk about soon. I don't know if it's next, but yeah, that's kind of what's going on in the info stealing world. It's more than just credentials being stolen now. It's your post authentication sessions, and that's MFA is not going to protect you from that unless your vendors are requiring step up off for anomalous requests using a previously generated session.
So is this the advocacy for things like YubiKeys and but first off, knowing your vendors, right?
Yes.
Like your account, knowing your critical supply chain, and then go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think YubiKey absolutely is the strongest MFA factor. I would say for your MSP employees, I would strongly advocate that you be requiring YubiKeys for your employees. My experience has been that SMBs just don't want to adopt hardware keys. And so I think everybody's kind of holding their breath, waiting to see if this passkey revolution that's promising to get rid of the password is actually going to be useful or not. But that doesn't protect you from the post-authentication attack. It will, from the extent that if the attacker wants to use the session from a new location, that it's going to be harder for them to social engineer you to providing them the token from a software app, or that got SMS texted to you or emailed to you. it'll be impossible for them to kind of man in the middle of that, which has also been a huge trend. This MFA bypass ecosystem with these proxies where they can stand up a lookalike site and actually steal the MFA token from you. That doesn't work so well if they're trying to like do the attack at night and you're asleep and they need to get the MFA token from you. Like you're not logging up and walking to your computer and loading a dummy site and putting that stuff in, which is why the sessions is really important. So question is, what do you do there? This is kind of the argument for having like a centralized identity management and SSO platform. And my experience has been MSPs tend to fall in two camps with this. One is why in the HE double hockey sticks would I put my put all of my services behind one authentication platform? That seems like all your eggs in one basket and a bad idea. My argument has always been it's easier for you to be providing identity assertions and doing the full spectrum of authentication security in one place than thousands of places. And the beautiful thing about those platforms is they're going to have like literally buttons that you can click, which says, hey, if this IP address gets used from a different location, I forget what Microsoft calls it, but they actually have some like some configuration you can actually walk through and like tell it what to do when certain conditions are actually met. And so, similarly for Okta and all those types of things. So, I think, again, you talk about supply chain security for your vendors that aren't using some sort of well-known IDP SSO platform. It should be a conversation for you with them about what are you doing to protect against post-authentication session theft and reuse. And listen really closely to their answer, and that'll give you a sense of where you might have some supply chain risk in your critical SaaS apps.
Yeah, Chip, and ask Chip any comments here and any questions so far from anybody. Want to ask Ryan any questions about this so far?
My only comment is this has been a topic for several SASE calls in a row now, where we're discussing both the token harvest attack, the value of YubiKeys, the transition to FIDO. We're definitely singing the same song with Ryan, and I love hearing someone else describe all of this. That comes from a different angle and a different knowledge base. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's also like I still haven't cracked this. Not that we're going to do this on this call, but like it still baffles me that we're doing M365, but we're not for our SMB customers as MSPs, but we're not. We're not using the built-in SSO capabilities for that. And those SSO capabilities are not just for the M365 ecosystem. You can use them to plug in to a lot of your vendors, which their default is their homegrown authentication system. Many of them will let you configure those through SSO, whether it's SAML or OpenID or other kind of well-established secure federation protocols. To me, that's becoming like an essential component of protecting an SMB is having some sort of distinct platform where you can really focus on securing the credentials. Now, I will automatically contradict myself, which you all know me to do. You are not going to get 100% of your SaaS applications into an IDP. Well, why is that? Well, some of them will require you to pay more to do SSO, or some of them don't, frankly, just don't support it. And so then your question becomes, well, what do I do there? That's a tricky problem. I don't have a great answer for that, other than like, that's where you need to get really vocal and tell them that they absolutely need to do this to retain your business. And then frankly, I would argue that you need to get into some collective bargaining, get into some peer groups, gain a community of people that are willing to apply pressure in order to change those things. Frankly, I think there's another avenue here, which is find someone in the MSP vendor ecosystem that will listen to you and will be willing to kind of lead the way and bring the entire vendor ecosystem along with you. That was kind of my philosophy for my time at Datto, is we were going to be a force for change. We were going to change defaults, we were going to require things, and we were going to make things de facto for the MSP ecosystem, and kind of lead the way. So you got to find those people and leverage them. I think Andy has his hand up, so let's go to Andy. I don't know if anybody else does. Andy's just the only one I can see.
Yeah, Ryan, thank you. I have, I guess, two ways to ask the question. One is taking what you're providing us today and coalescing this into a communication that one could have with a business that isn't MSP focused is something I'm perplexed by. I mean, I'm really saying I totally get business email compromise is the single biggest thing that we need to address. Great. How do we prevent that? Well, we could randomize the email address. Well, that doesn't work really, because it'll ultimately get back to you. So post then we get into, and is there not a method to tie session tokens to a particular MAC address or IP? And it's kind of like thinking of a firewall, the way that would work. Or so that's, I guess, my question.
There are ways to do it. I'm going to answer you in reverse. There are ways to do it, but if you want the easy button, that's why you need to use an SSO IDP provider like Azure AD or Okta or something similar like that, where you can literally just configure that setting and tell it what you want the more secure thing to do. I think, you do not, this is a technical conversation for people that already understand the importance of cybersecurity. You do not have this same conversation with an SMB. And so I'll channel my inner Brian Blakely, who's frankly has had an impact on me, and I think Andrew as well as a number of MSPs. You need to put this cyber risk, which is what this is, in business terms that the SMB understands. So it all needs to tie back to how they make money, what they're worried about. And so, you have the conversation with them about, talk to me about how your business makes money. Okay. And what are the critical systems that are involved in that? Okay. And what would happen if those critical systems were to become unavailable? Or what would happen if those critical systems were to become compromised? And you kind of back into this conversation from a perspective of really a risk assessment that's tied to the things they care about. And then you can relate those things back to the services offerings that you have, which will ideally include things like MFA and some sort of centralized identity management platform for them. So
may I ask, raising this question then to SaaS alerts, is there any way to tie session tokens or that piece to a device or a geographic location so that we could, impossible travel I know is one aspect, but I'm thinking post authentication.
We already do that, Andy.
I know. I was trying to promote something here.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
So
we love you, Andy. We love you.
Andy, the other thing I'd comment on is that, SSO can be a challenging concept, even for MSPs, let alone their customers.
Yeah.
But OAuth is not. And OAuth is certainly, even Okta considers OAuth SSOs, the other side of the coin, and really can be used just as appropriately in a lot of spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And if you focus on training people to use OAuth, which is drop dead easy, they all know how to log into 365 or Google Workspace. Almost every SaaS application has the opportunity for them to sign in with Google or sign in with Microsoft. So focus on securing that Microsoft login. Absolutely do what we do, and we've talked about this before at SaaS. Set the token timeout to a low value, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, whatever. Just knock it down so that that token can't get harvested easily.
That's a phenomenal point.
Yep.
Truly phenomenal point.
And also move to YubiKeys, start looking at how you're going to adopt pass keys instead of passwords. There are ways that are really accessible that you can take to businesses. And let me tell you something about the YubiKey experience that we've recently had, because SaaS alerts recently ourselves converted everyone on our engineering team. We're in the process of getting the rest of the company onto YubiKeys. Once you use them,
Thank you, Ryan. Ryan's
realize,
applauding us. Thank you, Ryan.
once you start using them, you realize that it is so much easier and so much more convenient, because you're just username YubiKey. That's it. It's as simple as could be.
It's faster than
the-
waiting for a text message.
And the users will love it. The complaint of, oh, I don't want to have to open an authorization app. I don't want to have to get an SMS message and type something in. Like, by the way, I can't even really believe that that's a complaint people make, like that they're so unwilling to secure their own data that little step bothers them. But okay, there's a way to take it away. And it's a YubiKey, and they come in all shapes and sizes, biometric, RFID. The RFID one can be in your pocket, and it works for identity anywhere on any device. It's really, it's a game changer.
So let me tie that
improving
back.
Security.
Let me tie that back to two things we just talked about. One is you're not going to get every SaaS app in the world behind your SSO provider. That OAuth concept is really important because, for example, when we were at Datto, there was a certain SaaS app we used that that was going to require us to pay an exorbitant amount more just for the SSO integration, but they supported login from another platform that was already protected behind our IDP. So what you can actually do is if Microsoft, let's say you had Okta, for example, let's say Okta was front-ending Microsoft, which you can do. Most people would use Microsoft's thing, but you could do that. But then you have another SaaS app, but you can't directly integrate it because you'd have to upgrade that SaaS app. You can just use the OAuth from Microsoft over to that SaaS app, and you don't have to pay. But because Microsoft is behind your IDP, you've effectively gotten the centralized SSO security on that other account. So the OAuth flow is actually a really good way to pull some of these other SaaS apps in where you might otherwise have to pay for an upgraded user license for that. And on the YubiKey side, one of the things, when I moved the entire company over to YubiKeys, I don't know, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago at Datto, one of the things we did is we gave every employee a 30-day period to use both and to let us know if there are any usability challenges. And what we actually found is 90% of all users by the end of the 30-day window were 100% using their YubiKeys, because it was annoying to find their phone and open the software app. It was annoying to wait for the text message. It was, I got to switch the application to go to my email. Like, they actually started to realize it was easier. And the only time you had a problem is when they forgot their YubiKey, but that's when you can come up with some creative ways to get around that. But yeah, so anyway, so let's keep talking about this. We could probably talk about this, all the various facets of this for 4 hours, but so what's the deal with account, info stealers, account takeover, and BEC? Well, this year, so when you talk about social engineering, which BEC, is fundamentally a social engineering problem, right? There are kind of two ways you could think about social engineering over email. One's called pretexting and one's called phishing. The real difference between phishing and pretexting is phishing tends to have some sort of thing you need to interact with, like a URL, an attachment, something along those lines. Maybe a hidden link embedded in a pixel that'll automatically get rendered and opened from your Outlook client, et cetera, things like that. A pretexting email is literally just a persona and a story. Hey, this is your CFO. This vendor just contacted me and they have a new bank account. Here's the information. Could you please route all future payments to this account? That's just a story. That's pure pretexting. And this year, what Verizon actually showed was pretexting attacks. I think Andrew might have previewed this with you last week. Was pretexting attacks actually are overtaking phishing emails. Doesn't mean phishing emails aren't a problem, because phishing, credential phishing is still a very successful way to get credentials. But what's happening in the BEC world now is, so I get your credentials to your M365 or your session, and then I open it up. And then what I do from within your M365 is I sit there and I wait. I wait for some sort of email to come across regarding payment, or depending on, if I get the CFO's email, that I just send an email as the CFO, but I actually sit and I inject myself into an existing thread in order to reroute funds. And so this method is becoming so successful for attackers that it's starting to become kind of one of the primary things they do, and we need to start walking. So now you need to start teaching your employees about thread jacking and all this other stuff. But frankly, if you had really, really good authentication security around M365, the only thing you would need to be worried about is the stuff that's easier to detect, like the lookalike domains being used, and like the phishing email that you get from a Gmail or a Yahoo. Like those things are easier to train your users on. Teaching your users about thread jacking and how to detect that is an incredibly complicated thing. And frankly, I'm sitting here, like I could tell you there's probably a 10% chance I would fall for one of them, because you're not in your high alert mode when you're interacting with people's emails that are clearly from within your organization. And frankly, that problem is entirely avoidable by having strong authentication on I'm going to call it your collaboration platform, because it's more than just email. We'll talk about some threat actors in a minute, why I'm using the collaboration term. But this is this is the next wave of BEC attacks, and we're going to continue to see more and more BEC attacks are going to be facilitated by threat actors that have access to the email addresses and are using account takeover as their vehicle. And we're actually going to talk about this really, really in depth at Right of Boom this year. It's going to be a big topic for us because it's an emerging trend, and it's difficult to detect against. It's like, what do you do? So how many you've all, I assume, have heard of Lapsus? Lapsus is a group which is thinking about account takeover and email. Lapsus's entire MO is to use social engineering. So they will send emails. They will create very kind of advanced phishing campaigns to target typically some sort of essential supply chain vendor to what we call big game companies. So large enterprises, public companies, multi-billion-dollar companies. But all they did was use social engineering. And then they get a credential, and then in one attack, they actually used that credential to log into a Slack instance of a third party that was providing support to Okta. And they were actually able to use that access to that Slack instance of Okta to go in and change the configuration of some of the customers in order to get themselves access into some of these large enterprises and facilitate frankly, some very embarrassing data breaches. And it really just kind of underscores the importance of taking this threat seriously, because here you have a group that is not really using any sort of sophisticated attack methods. They're not creating new exploits. They're not using advanced malware. They're literally just sending emails and messages inside of collaboration platforms in order to facilitate data breaches. And so, the kind of, the so what here is, okay, so the identity management practices around your collaboration platform are becoming really important. And one of the things we know is when one group that's high profile has success with specific attack method, pretty soon we're going to see all groups adopting their successful tradecraft. Like all in air quotes, not literally all, but a lot of them will start to adopt those. And so you say, okay, well, that's big game hunting. That doesn't apply to us. Well, guess what? It does apply to us. It's applied to us for years. And Andrew, I don't know if you can advance the slide for me, but there's a threat actor that I've been chasing and following since I started in Datto way back in 2017. I think it was 2017, yeah, called Sheriff. And this attacker is active on dark web forums and all over the place, specifically looking to buy credentials to MSPs or to MSP ecosystem vendors in order to facilitate buffalo jump attacks through SMBs, through MSPs to their SMB customers. And so you think, well, Lapsus is looking for credentials and buying credentials from info stealers and then using those in social engineering to get them and yada, yada. This has been happening in our industry for years. This is not a large enterprise, big game hunting only tactic. This has been being used against MSPs and against SMBs for years. And the fact that it's becoming more public and more successful, largely just, there's already been an ecosystem for these creds. It's only going to get, more and more and more. So that's kind of your look at the landscape. So CLOP, sometimes with a C, sometimes with a K, sometimes with a 0 instead of an O. They're I would say a newcomer. They've been around a while, but they're definitely making headlines right now with the MOVEit vulnerability. What's kind of interesting here is you have an extortion group that's not using ransomware. You have a ransomware operator not using ransomware in order to affect the kind of their attacks and their ultimate payment against customers. This actually has nothing to do with identity security, but it does signal a change in tactic. And so identity theft, identity credential compromise, account takeover tends to either happen in the initial access phase or the persistence phase of or the credential access persistence phase of an attack, which is kind of like the beginning to middle of an attack if you think about it in terms of an attack chain. What's interesting here now is these groups are getting in using vulnerabilities, they're harvesting creds, they're then turning around and using those creds, they're selling those creds. So that becomes an entire, because there's such an ecosystem now and a bunch of these dark web forums where you can sell this stuff, they're harvesting this out to sell and to further monetize their attack to other employees or to other hackers. We haven't necessarily seen this or tied this to CLOP yet, but this is well known as a thing that attackers are doing. And Andrew, jog my memory. I know there was something else we wanted to talk about here, but it's escaping me. Do you remember?
In terms of this piece, let me just check real quick, Ryan.
Yeah, my addled brain can't remember.
We talked about the evolution of the supply chain. Oh, the fact that ransomware is kind of out. Did you want to go a little deeper into that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's out.
I shouldn't say out.
Per se, right? I mean, I think it's always been cyclical, and I think we're in a down cycle. And what we're seeing, at least what the Verizon data breach report would kind of indicate to us, is that there's a lot more innovation happening on the how do I get access to companies and how do I extort them not using ransomware. So ransomware is actually, you look at Revol, their attack landed them in some big trouble. Ryuk and Conti got themselves in some deep water. You ransom the wrong company, next thing you know, feds are knocking on your door. And so they're kind of realizing that while ransomware is really effective in getting payment, it also was kind of leading their downfall. And so, with kind of the advent of the war in Ukraine and, the initial days of that was a lot of denial of service and frankly still is, which tends to coincide with, kinetic attacks. A lot of these ransomware operators, these hackers are moonlighting either, for both sides. And they're getting real proficiency in this stuff. And we're starting to see a dramatic uptick in denial of service. And so that's another kind of tool in their tool chest to to kind of, extort payment without necessarily landing themselves in a ton of hot water. So it's definitely interesting. I think, we're going to have to stay tuned to see exactly what the long-term impacts are. But I think, my money's on, we're going to continue to see advancements in extortion. We saw that with Black Cat last year, actually creating a public leak site that anybody could view. And they were really, really nefarious. They actually took the website of the customers that they compromised and copied it. And the breach site was actually like a copy of the website, but they added a navigation bar so that you could navigate all the files that they stole from that company. And so like a lot of these innovations, I think we're going to continue to see to apply pressure to victims to pay is interesting. So a little sidebar there on like what's happening in that ecosystem, but it still relates back. So anyway, what to do, right? Did you want me to move on, Andrew?
Yeah, just because we're right at the top of the hour, so I just want to.
Okay, yeah, I'm not watching the time.
I know this hour goes by really fast, Ryan.
Yeah, so again, MFA, strong MFA. Wherever you can, YubiKeys, drag your customers along kicking and screaming, make IDP SSO part of your base services offering. In 2 years, you will be so happy you did, because if you don't start that process now and work over the next year to start moving your customers in that direction, they're going to be sitting ducks. Going back to the conversation Andy and I were having, have the conversation with them in business terms around how you're going to protect the things that matter most to them and make them money. CIS controls for account management, I think it's CIS Control 5 is a great place to go to start. And if you need more information on the CIS controls, Andrew West, me and Phyllis Lee of CIS do a podcast called the Cybercast. We actually go in depth on each control area one by one. If I remember right, that was actually one of my favorite episodes. I think it was a lot of fun. So that's a great way to kind of get some more info on how to advance your stack there. And it's getting crazy out there. So as always, be well and be safe.
All right.
I hope this was useful.
I thought it was fantastic.
Awesome.
Chip, what do you think?
Awesome.
Can't thank you enough, Ryan. It was great.
Yeah, reinforces everything that we believe here at SaaS Source.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Love to get some highlight clips from this, Michelle, and get them out on social.
Definitely.
Yeah, Brian, thanks. We'd love to have you back. I think it was great. And, as we were kind of talking about, not necessarily right around the 4th. So, Jim, you want to wrap us up and we'll head on out.
Ryan, thank you very much. And we appreciate you. We appreciate what you do for the community. I think everybody on this call does. And looking forward to seeing you again, hopefully on this call. And hope everyone has a great 4th of July weekend.
Great. Thanks again, Ryan. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ryan. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.